In this exercise, we're going to work on the curved seam. There are two pieces to the curved seam, so make sure that when you're looking at your pattern pieces, they both say curved seam. So they also say RSU, right side up. So that means that we cannot flip these pattern pieces over like this to cut them. We need to see all of the information face side up. So let's go ahead and lay our fabric out and cut. Now I don't have a selvage, so I'm going to just tug on this. I have some stretch there, no stretch here, so this is my straight grain. So when I lay these out, I want to lay it along, matching my straight grain arrow along with the straight grain, just double checking. But instead of having this piece so close here to the ripped edge, I could actually conserve fabric if I lower it a little bit and try to tuck this other piece right in there. And I can just kind of check. That will fit just like that. So this is where I'm going to cut this piece out. I'm going to mark it, so I will weight it down. Mark the perimeter of the pattern. And then don't forget the notches, very important. Now that one's done. Now again, I can line up my curved piece, make sure it's along the straight grain, and then just tuck it right inside the curve of the other piece. And I'm going to weight this one down as well. And then I can mark this piece. And then once you're done marking the perimeter on this, go back and mark your notches. And now on this fabric here is actually going to be cut out. So I'm just putting marks there to remind me that that's actually going to be cut out. And now I'm going to cut this out. All right, so now that I've got these two pieces cut out, here are the face side. I'm going to use a marking pen to mark the face side. Now, let's not forget to do our notches, clip our notches. Remember, only half of that seam allowance, so only about 1/4 inch at the most that we're clipping in. So now the seam allowance for this curved seam runs right here on this side and runs along this side on this piece. So this is what we call a concave, and this is what we call a convex. And these two pieces are kind of opposing each other. So to get this one started, I'm going to start up here and match my two seam allowance notches up here. And I'm going to pin this right at the top. But notice that once I get to about here, this starts curving off this way and this piece curves off this way. Well, we have to manage to get these seams to be equal to match the notches and then to be sewn all the way back around to match the other notch. How do we do that? Well, there are a couple of different methods. There's one method where you could actually pull and kind of stretch and ease that all the way in, and you could for sure probably do that on this curve. But I'm not a real fan of pulling unless you have a slider curve. This one is rather drastic. If you have a more slight curve and maybe your seam allowance is 1/4 inch, that might actually work to where you could actually kind of tug and get everything in there. But because this is a more drastic curve and we have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, we're going to do a clipping method where once we get to the part where the two edges veer off of each other, we're going to come, while we're in the machine, come underneath and we're going to clip the larger piece. And then we'll sew. And then when the pieces start going away from it, we're going to come up and we're going to clip underneath close to where the seam line would be. Now, remember, we have 1/2 inch seam lines on both. So you can, let me unpin this so you can see it. If you want to help guide you, you could use your ruler and just mark your seam allowance all the way around. If you want to do that for one and then do another one without to see how you feel about the difference, you may also do that. Remember, these types of seams are for your practice, but of course, when you add them to any kind of notebook, you want to see all of your finished pieces and then put notes on them. So I'm marking my seam allowance all the way around so that after I sew this, we can see how close we stayed to the seam allowance. And that's very important because the seam allowance identifies the size of your garment, right? So we'll pin this one to get started up here at the top. And now we're ready to go to the machine. Okay, so I'm ready to sew my curved seam, and I have it previously pinned up here. We're gonna match our 1/2 inch notch here for our 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I just had this pinned like this to keep it together, and we're sewing face sides together, okay? And remember, we have a notch here and a notch here on the opposite piece, and we're hopefully going to be matching those. We need to match those pretty right on. But what we're going to do, remember that I had my seam line kind of marked on both pieces. We're hoping to keep that 1/2 inch seam allowance. And what we're going to do, once we get to the curved part here, we're going to come and under the bottom piece, this is the bottom piece, we're going to actually make slashes to that seam line as we sew, but not before. So I'm going to get this started. I think I'm going to remove this pin, line these up again, and fabric underneath the presser foot, 1/2 inch seam allowance. And you see here, let's see, we can't really see it yet. Let me sew a little bit. I'm going to start with a back stitch, and I'm just going to sew a little bit so we can see the fabric in the camera. See here where this curved edge here starts curving away from the under part, they start parting ways. This is where we want to stop, and this is where we want to put our first clip in. So I'm going to sew up to about that point, right? I think I'll put the needle in the fabric, and I'm going to lift my presser foot, lift the top fabric, and I'm going to clip almost to the seam allowance. I don't think I want to clip it all the way because we still need to have the fabric for the stitch to hold on to. But what I can do now is that I can pull that so that the seam, I can get my raw edges of my seams to match. So I'm going to sew a little bit more, and you see where the two start turning away from each other. Put more stitch, put the needle down, lift up your presser foot, get that top fabric out of the way and clip into about where that seam allowance is, maybe a 1/16 or an eighth of an inch away. And when you make your clips, I prefer to make them perpendicular to the needle. Okay, so now again, I can turn the fabric, match the raw edges of the fabric, put the presser foot down. I can sew a little bit more at that 1/2 inch. And you see we're coming up to matching my notches. So that's one of those areas where we know that we can match that. So I'm just going to pull this over and match it at the notch. And I will sew up to that notch. I'm keeping my 1/2 inch seam allowance. And do I need to clip in here? What I'm going to do is I'm going to do with the presser foot, clip in here just before I get to that area. Clip in, and then I can pull this away, making sure that you're not going to get any kind of gathering or puckering on this side, and you can kind of manipulate that fabric. And then just double check underneath that you're not going to get any pleating. If I want to be careful once I get to this spot that I don't actually pleat the fabric. So I'm just going to manipulate this, push some of this kind of away. And I've got my edges matching, and I'm going to sew. So we're not actually turning the fabric in the machine, we're actually sewing a straight line, but we're being very careful about matching those raw edges, right? And what's happening underneath here, I'm constantly kind of pushing this fabric away from where the needle is. Okay, and then I'm going to sew a little bit more. I'm going to probably sew up to about here because I think I can make one more clip. Needle down, I'm going to lift the presser foot. I'm going to get in underneath there. One more little clip there. I can turn this fabric so the raw edges match. Sew a little bit more. And it looks like I might need to make one more clip. And then I can turn this, make sure my raw edges are together. And then I can just kind of turn this up and notice, because I forgot to clip my notches, but you can see my notches now are matching here at the edge. Match those. Sewing a straight line, we're always sewing a straight line. We've never turned the fabric around in a curving motion. And I'm going to backstitch. Needle up, I can pull the fabric out. I've clipped these. Now let's have a look. Actually, let me clip off this other fabric, this other thread here on the side. So let's have a look at my stitching line all the way around. That actually looks pretty good. And the other side, I have the clips in. And then if we turn it so we can see the face side, right? We've got a nice smooth curve here, and I've pretty much maintained, really got a little problem here, but it looks like I come right back into the seam, but I've matched all of those seam line markings very well. So let's have another look at it, and we'll go over to the pressing mat. Okay, so let's finish up this curved seam. So this is what the outside looks like right now, and this is what the inside, nothing is pressed. And what I like to do, I actually just kind of like to press along the seam line, folding all this kind of fabric back, and I think I'll do it on this side. And I just want to press that seam stitching line just to set those stitches. And then what I can do, and now you want to press the seam allowance. You could press it in this way, but then you'd get all this rippling. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to press it away from this corner curved piece. I'm going to press it toward what we'll call this the garment. But I'm going to do it from the face side because I want to make sure I get a really nice ridge line here. So I can press just like right along here. And even if you're using muslin, you can do that with your fingers to flatten everything. And I'm just going to press this really quick. And here we have a nice flat seam, and what's nice about this is that on this ridge here on the outside, it covers all of my clippings. Now you could come back in here and fold this fabric away and overlock this edge to make it really clean, and in a garment you would probably want to do that if it was not lined. But because this is a sample, I want to be able to see what I've done. So I'm not going to overlock that. This is for my sample book, so I'm just going to keep it exactly like this.